I mean, this kind of exploded on us a few years ago, right? Especially, I think, in the wake of something like the George Floyd
Mm,
killing, where all of a sudden, we had the resurgence of this idea of corporate guilt, right? And I would say pretty obviously, it seemed to me that the idea was that corporate guilt was the burden of white people, whoever might be defined or construed as white. I mean, that was pretty ambiguous as well. But, so that there's in those and this is there's literature on this that goes, of course, predates any of these events in recent history. But where it seemed to me, at least, that there was something going on here, like a transposition of this idea of corporate guilt and the need for corporate punishment that maybe we just talked about in the Old Testament, but now where it was being applied to a particular cultural group in the contemporary context, right? White people, to the point where we saw things like almost ritualistic things being carried out, like in Minneapolis when I think it was the mayor sort of made this almost propitiatory sort of act in front of a bunch of BLM Black Lives Matter activists, like asking for sort of forgiveness and stuff. And I remember they kind of said, "Get the hell out of here," or whatever. But and there was this. I mean, I don't know what your sense of it was. As an Old Testament scholar, I'd love your take on what we saw 2021, 22, because there was so much talk about white guilt, the burden or the America's original sin. And to me, it felt very Old Testament kind of idea that was being sort of just put on display in front of us.
so I would read it very differently,
Okay.
in that I think it absolutely had nothing to do with Old Testament things. Because so let's take the Achan Rahab example.
Yeah.
Okay, in this, if it is identity based, then Achan gets a pass and Rahab is convicted because the Canaanite culture is bad. Okay. And so, although the language of generational sin, it actually was never founded on sort of biblical principles. It was founded mostly on sort of a contemporary approach to power struggle. So, whether you want to think of intersectionality or you want to think of sort of critical race theory, it's founded on an identity based set of oppositions. And that's actually not what the Old Testament does. It's a mischaracterization of the Old Testament, right? So the issues in Ezra and Malachi, and some scholars will disagree with this, but I think it's not a great reading of the text. They're not criticized and they're not punished for marrying outside their ethnicity. They're being punished for marrying people who are not followers of Yahweh, right? So this is what
Right.
happens with Solomon. What you're told, if you marry women who worship other gods, they're going to lead you into idolatry. So the issue is always faithfulness towards God, not ethnicity, right? So Rahab comes in, she's Canaanite. Her ethnicity is irrelevant. Ruth is a Moabitess. Tamar is probably a Canaanite. These are all women who come into the faith. Their ethnicity is irrelevant because they follow Yahweh. Likewise, others who are of Israel are judged because they aren't following Yahweh. Your ethnicity doesn't matter, right? This is Paul's, not everybody who's of Abraham is really of Abraham. So at the moment that you take this and think of generational punishment as being identity based, right, ethnically based,
Yeah.
then you are well outside anything that's in the Old Testament in terms of that, because these constant counterexamples are there to say, don't go down that road. This is about your relationship. Now, with that said, there are aspects of the Old Testament that talk about the sinfulness of culture, right? So in Hosea 1 and 2, you get Hosea's children presented, his literal children with Gomer. And then you get a flip where you have more children being talked about. So we know we're into the metaphor now, not his actual children, but you flip on into chapter 2. You get there, and they say, plead with your mother. And what's being talked about here is you are the product of a culture, Mother Israel. And that culture is so saturated with sin. You need to plead to your culture, to your fellow Israelites, to return to God. So I think we can talk about a sinful culture. And to that extent, if you could talk about a group that has power within a culture and they're
Yep.
propagating things that then benefit us and denigrate or harm you, you could talk about cultural sins in that way, but
Yeah.
it can't be based on ethnicity and those kinds of things. In that way, right? We get to there's no Greek, no Jew, there's no
Yep.
male, female, no Gentile. We move in that direction. So there's a fine line here. We can talk about cultural sins, but the way it was presented in my mind was about identity based assignments of guilt.
Of
And that's a
guilt and
separate
sin.
kind of
Yeah.
an issue.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I mean, I don't know how many articles I wrote against critical theory over the last 4 or 5 years unpacking the a lot of the primary sources, probably read more on the Frankfurt School than most people would ever want to, but I think that's right. And I almost feel like then in a sense, there's I don't strike me as speculative that the relation of the primacy of ethnic identity that is going on in that whole world of critical theory or critical race theory almost feels to me very pagan. I mean, it feels like a very pagan, like you're born. Well, I've read some of the literature and I can say that this is how exactly how it does read in the literature. You are born X ethnicity, X, Y, or Z ethnicity. And this is the way you are, right? It's so again, very mechanistic, deterministic, grounded in kind of like what the Nazis said, blood and soil, right? Like,
Well,
and you
well,
can
but
do
these
no other.
ideas
Yeah.
are in the scriptures, right? So it is far easier for me to say God will accept me because I am Jewish, right? Or I am this, that, or the other. Therefore, I'm
Yeah.
good. And it's always been like, no, 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 no.
I'm
It's
a
the
son
one
of
who
Abraham.
does this, right? So no, so
Mhm.
you have to move in this direction. So it has always been an easy way of saying I'm in or you're out, right? So
Out.
to
Yeah.
become in, you need to move to my culture, right? So this is the Judaizing tendency of the New Testament,
Right.
those
Right.
sorts of things. So we've always had these shortcuts, these mechanical ways of doing that. And then what they do is they do skirt the issue of, okay, am I participating in an unjust culture? And am I contributing to it? Do I have sinful thoughts, dispositions, attitudes in me that contribute? Or maybe that I've just been, you're right, I'm the frog in the kettle. And I've never noticed that I'm here and go, wow, I never saw that in myself. But now, so, right. So then we do get to the individual level. And I'm not
Yeah.
exempt simply because I say, well, it's not identity based. So I'm not guilty just because I'm X ethnicity. But I still have to ask the question, am I guilty? In individual relationships? Am I guilty in
Right.
taking from culture these ideas? And so we have to do the harder work of actually asking what's in my heart, what have been in my actions and my engagements, both passively, what have I not engaged in, and actively, what have I done? What ideas have I absorbed that I've not pushed back on? Those kinds of things. So it's actually far harder to do that kind of nitty gritty work than to either blame or excuse based on sort of just ethnic
Some
approaches.
some basic social feature, some
Yeah.
just inherent or involuntary feature of a person.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
could be social status.
Yeah.
All right. So you're wealthy, you
Class
must be
based.
guilty. You're poor, you must be guilty. Right. That runs in
Or you
both
might, yeah,
directions.
or you must be innocent if you're poor, which is the other way around, right?
Right,
Yeah.
so you run in both.
Yeah.
Well, you get the
Yeah.
other, right? You're wealthy, you must have done this hard work, so you're free, right? So depending on the class that you're in, you
Yeah.
generally gauge the other class as being guilty. Your own class is good. So you get these kinds of things happening, and it avoids the hard work of actually looking at the heart, actually looking at actions in context, and then saying, okay, I know I'm not truly righteous, so where do I need to repent? And those kinds of things, because I can just go, oh, well, I'm not guilty, so I'm scot free. And those are simplistic ways of getting at stuff.
Yeah, that's good. Boy, I felt like that whole discussion, and it's sort of say it's sort of winding down now, but for 4 or 5 years there, it was so just man, like in our faces. I felt that it was not handled well in the church, in the evangelical church. I don't won't speak to other traditions, but I just there was just a lot of I think there was a lot of bad preaching and teaching on that.
Well,
And
it's
maybe people just
complex.
felt overwhelmed.
Yeah.
They couldn't deal with it. They didn't know what was going on. You get maybe they felt surprised, um but that's good. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So, yeah. Um all right. So, I think we've done a good job on this issue. I mean, I don't know, is there anything else? I don't know what else right now to think about this. We have another topic that we're going to be dealing with shortly. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it's an important issue because it's still one that consistently gets brought up. And
Mhm.
more than anything, I think if we don't have a good understanding of how retribution works and how it's presented, how it's truly presented in the Old Testament, it can often lead to a splinter effect of splintering the
Uh,
Old Testament from the New, which then can lead down this old road, this
yeah.
well-worn road of separating the members of the Godhead from each other, as well as if Jesus is some different God uh, from Yahweh or the God of the Old Testament.
And it propagates basically a poor reading habit, right? So I ignore the covenantal context of national Israel in the old covenant.
Yeah.
But likewise, when you treat Jesus as being different from the God of the Old Testament because he's not judging, it's also a poor reading habit because it ignores the end, right? Last time I checked, he came once
Yeah.
on a donkey.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's coming back on the war horse to
Right.
destroy those who stand opposed to God. So again, it's a poor reading habit because it ignores the whole in the covenantal context. Yes, this moment is for proclaiming liberty, sight to the blind, right? Release of the captives. But there is the day of vengeance yet to come. And so both those have this fundamental error of ignoring the entirety of the context for the one that's kind of preferential.
Yeah,
And so
that's right.
it's kind of
Of
an out of
course.
context reading.
Yeah, and I have run into and this we won't get into the issue of universalism, but I have run into the occasional very honest universalist who will say you won't get universal in the sense of universal salvation from the words of Jesus. You're not gonna. You have to go elsewhere. You got to kind of stay away from the Gospels, and of course, Revelation still
Yeah,
always.
you've got to white
Yeah,
out all those bits
yeah,
about hell
yeah,
to get to a universalist out of it, right? You just got to
yeah.
exclude some things,
That's right.
and
That's
so
right.
it's yeah, just poor reading all around.